Hi, friends. This is John. Welcome back to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, where we talk about agronomic science and cultural management practices and all the fun things that are related to regenerating our soils, our lands, our stewardship, the economic opportunities on farms. Today, we have a conversation I've really been looking forward to for a while. And if you haven't encountered Stefan Van Vliet's work yet, then I really encourage you to look it up and to dig into some of the things that he's been doing. Stefan, I'm really excited to have you here today and for you to share more about the things you've been working on and your trajectory over the last decade or plus. Tell us a little bit about what you are studying. What's been the scope of your research, and when did you first start studying these topics more intensely, and what were your early questions that you were trying to get answers for?
So it started in 2019. Yeah, is when we started on this, and it kind of started interesting. I once got a call from two colleagues, and Fred Provenza being one of them, and then Scott Kronberg at the USDA being another one. And they are ecologists, animal scientists, and they gave me a call and said, Stefan, we heard you speak somewhere, and we're looking for a human nutrition scientist to collaborate with. We spend our careers looking at the livestock, grazing, and how different forage and feed selection impacts animal health, but we've never really made the bridge towards human nutrition. And I was already interested in wanting to study grass-fed beef, and it actually worked out. So it's kind of random that it worked out, but I was like, yeah, let's do it. And then the first year we tried to find funding, and of course, after many unsuccessful attempts, it became successful. And so the early work, what we did was we were just more looking at this, in-depth case studies. When I was in Duke University, we worked with 3 farms in the South. They were using rotational grazing practices, so we went there over the summer multiple times, collected pasture samples, soil samples, collected meat samples at the end, and we're also able to obtain meat and samples from a few feedlots, and made initial comparisons and found indeed that there are differences, and that those differences go quite a bit beyond just omega-3 fatty acids, which is what you typically hear from people. That's like, okay, grass-fed beef has a benefit for omega-3 fatty acids, but not really beyond that. But what we were finding is that if you use what we call a metabolomics approach, so it's really deep metabolic profiling of the food source, looking at hundreds of compounds, you actually see that there's quite a large number of differences based on what the animal ate. And what we've been studying a lot is phytochemicals, which are plant secondary compounds. So they're transferred from the forages into the meat. And these are things such as terpenes, polyphenols, tannins, flavonoids, etc. And we see that those are typically known more with the layman as antioxidants. They have all kinds of potential effects. If we throw many of these compounds in the laboratory on a cancer cell line, it may reduce the cancer proliferation. Not saying that the grass-fed beef reduces your risk for cancer. That's not what I'm implying. But my point is that these compounds, they get transferred from the animal. And it's kind of like, if you think about it as a human, right? If I were to ask you, John, if I put you on a Mediterranean diet for 3 months or a standard American diet for 3 months, you would say, well, of course I expect large differences at the end. Well, if we put
Absolutely.
animals on a total mixed ration for 4 months, or finish them out on pasture for 4 months, completely different diets, then all of a sudden we don't expect differences. And I must admit, it's easy to say now after the fact, because I was also not expecting these differences to this extent. I mean, there was some older research from the French and Italian scientists, particularly in cheese, that were looking at, what if we graze these animals through alpine landscapes or in Sardinia? And they were doing this for flavor. But then if you look at those compounds, chlorogenic acid, gallic acid, cinnamic acid, as a human nutrition scientist, I'm thinking about this, looking at this. Yes, these are flavor compounds, but these are also compounds that have potential health effects. And it's that combination between flavor and health. So that is what we were studying largely, and kind of took that work and started doing that in North American systems. Particularly what we've studied now is bison and beef, as well as milk.
My goodness, Stefan, your responses elicit about half a dozen more questions, and I'm not sure which pathway to go down. But why don't we start with the easy one? Is what have you been learning about beef and bison and milk? Like, how significant is the variation, and what have you learned so far?
So if we look at the term nutrient density, and typically it's how I at least define it, and others too, is the amount of beneficial nutrients per unit product. So it could be 4 ounces of beef, and if it has more nutrient density, it probably has more B vitamins, fat soluble vitamins, phytochemicals, more omega 3s, which are potentially beneficial nutrients. So what we've been finding is that there's quite a large variation in nutrient density if we sort of look at grass fed and grain fed as homogeneous groups, which they are not. There's grass fed isn't grass fed isn't grass fed, grain fed isn't grain fed. But for ease sakes, we see about a 40% difference in the abundance of many of these nutrients. So sometimes higher, sometimes lower.
Is that a 40% variability within each of those two groups or between the two groups?
Between the two groups. Within
Okay.
each groups, especially grass-fed, it's a little bit of a wild west. We found an 11-fold variation between samples. So the lowest grass-fed and the highest grass-fed were 11-fold difference if in many of the, especially plant secondary metabolites.
And how much overlap is there between the lowest grass-fed and the grain-fed?
So the highest grain fed is probably twice as nutrient dense as the lowest grass fed, but the highest grass fed is still 6, 7 times more nutrient dense than the highest grain fed. If we
Yeah.
consider these phytochemicals and omega 3 fatty acids, particularly.
You know, you have a really interesting perspective approaching this from a human nutrition background. What are the implications of these higher levels of plant secondary metabolites coming through meat, coming through livestock products, and being consumed by people? Like there's like on one level, we intuitively understand that this must have some positive benefits for our own immune systems. But I'd love to just hear your perspective from a human nutrition point of view. Like, what are some of the possible manifestations, and how might this play out from a public health and a human nutrition view?
I have no idea, John. There haven't been any randomized controlled trials done yet. So we're running two in our lab at the moment. A very acute study where we're just comparing grass-fed beef, grain-fed beef, and an Impossible Burger, and pulling blood from people for 5 hours afterwards to see.
I would only volunteer for one of those three categories.
Yeah, well, we don't tell you, so you wouldn't know, right? We're blind, you're blinded for it, and but yes, so am I, so are we. But I when I walk through the hall and into one of the exam rooms, I can definitely smell whether it's an Impossible Burger or beef. I don't think I can pick up the smell difference between grass fed and grain fed, but if I say hi to the participants and
Wow.
check up on them, then yeah, I know immediately if they got an Impossible Burger or not because it has a very distinct smell, especially in the morning because they consume it first thing in the morning on an empty stomach and then stay in our lab. So that's the initial thing. We're just really interested. We see difference in composition. Obviously, the difference in composition between beef and an Impossible Burger is much larger than grass-fed and grain-fed beef because you're comparing a plant and an animal. There we found a 90% difference in metabolite abundance. But yeah, for now, it's just trying to understand, does your blood look different? Because you can actually see things in the blood already that are coming from the food source. Early on in my career, we did a lot of amino acid tracer studies. So we would have a labeled amino acid that was actually incorporated into an egg or meat by feeding the animal that labeled tracer. So it's a stabilized isotope tracer that kind of has a flag on the amino acid. And then if you eat that egg, then you see it appear in your blood after about 15 minutes already. So you are what you eat. There's a truth to that saying, is your blood starts to somewhat reflect what you just ate. And so that's initial study, and then we're doing a longer term trial as well. Actually, two longer term trial. One is though we're not per se isolating the effects of beef in that one or animal source food, but we're comparing a regenerative diet, which is mean all foods are sourced from regenerative agriculture, and all foods are sourced from conventional agriculture, and people consume those diets for 7 weeks each with blood, urine, and stool collections pre and post. And we give them their entire diet. So the meat is more from conventional systems, either CAFOs or grain fed, but also the produce is either coming just your regular non-organic store-bought produce or coming from integrated systems. So that's one. But then also we're looking at beef, pork, chicken, and eggs specifically as well in a separate study. So we have multiple randomized controlled trials going on that we're trying to at least hope to find out, like, okay, does this have an appreciable effect on human health, or do we see anything changing in people's blood? especially with randomized controlled trials, you're measuring more biomarkers. You cannot say anything about long-term. Well, you can make an assessment on it, but obviously no one's going to develop heart disease in a 7-week study. And if they do, then I probably have some explaining to do to the IRB. So, so that's not the case. But you see inflammatory markers or cardiovascular risk markers change. So, long story short is that we don't know the answer. We'll have to perform randomized controlled trials. But yeah, this is really came out of the fact that when we started to profile beef and bison, that we saw differences that went quite a bit beyond just omega-3 fatty acids. So on paper, I would say, yes, grass-fed beef or grass-fed bison looks healthier. Whether this translates to a beneficial effects on human health, not sure. What we do know, though, is the following, that if you eat grass-fed beef or pasture-raised animal source foods, you see the blood omega-3 profile of consumers go up. If you eat grain-fed beef in a randomized controlled trial, it typically stays at the level where it's at. And that's been known for about 20 years.
So let's go back to the studies that you've been conducting on beef and bison and milk. You've described the remarkable variation and variability that you've observed. And so these health markers within the livestock, I think this certainly is valuable and important information for anyone who's producing livestock, but also considering the possible implications that there might be, or the probable implications, I would even say, that we're likely to discover human health correlations once we figure out what it is that we're looking for. What contributes to the variation in phytonutrient density? What are the contributing factors that you've been able to identify that really contribute to producing really nutrient-dense foods? And that also kind of begs the question, there's this constant conversation that keeps evolving of what defines nutrient density? What is nutrient density? So that's perhaps even a precursor question.
Yeah, I mean, there's no set definition for nutrient density, but like I said, I consider it to be the amount of beneficial nutrients per unit product. So typically I think of it in 100 grams. That's how we express it. And that's how it's expressed in the USDA nutrient reference database. So let's say if you have more alpha tocopherol and beta carotene, which are precursors to vitamin A and as well as vitamin E. If those are twice as high per 100 gram beef, I'd say that is more nutrient dense. If the omega-3s are 5 times higher in grass-fed beef versus grain-fed beef, I'd say that's more nutrient dense. If the antioxidants are twice as high, I would say that's more nutrient dense. So that is kind of how we define it. But there's also the interesting thing is that maybe you get less of the stuff you don't want as well. I mean, we've also been looking at things such as, and this is you really get at the intersection of, are we looking at animal health? Are we looking at human nutrition here? If we measure things like homocysteine or 4-HNE, which is a lipid peroxidation product, these are higher in grain-fed animals, which is probably due to them having a little bit more oxidative stress. And those things, when they are higher in our blood, are associated with an increased risk of metabolic disease. Now, we don't know how that relates to us consuming that from beef, but these are also things that we are thinking of. But the lipid peroxidation, it happens within the animal. It's probably a marker of their status of metabolic health, but we also know it's a marker of our status of metabolic health. So then, when we eat that, what is the impact on that? And yeah, those are some of the remaining other questions that we have as well.
You mentioned a bit ago that we've known for 20 years that consuming grass-fed beef can have an impact on the omega-3 profiles in our blood. And I find this interesting because I've heard other nutritionists make the argument that grass-fed beef is not a significant dietary source of omega-3, and that if we want to consume omega-3s, we need to be consuming salmon or something like that. What is your perspective?
Yeah, I know, that's a popular. It's one of those things that someone starts to say it, and then everyone starts to repeat it, and then it becomes truth. And then if you actually look at the literature, there's probably 10 randomized controlled trials, not just on beef, mind you. There's only been 2 on beef. There's another one on horse meat. We don't consume it in the US, but elsewhere in the world consume it. There's on pasture chicken, pork. I want to say, a few other studies as well. I want to say yak meat, I think, is another one. And then I think
across the spectrum, in other words.
Yeah, across the spectrum. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. If you eat omega-3 enriched meats, then you see the blood profile. So I always find that quite interesting when people say that, because there's some good evidence, probably 8 to 12 randomized controlled trials that clearly have shown that. And this was already known in the 90s. Sinclair, which was an Australian scientist, first studied this in the 90s, and he was feeding people kangaroo, whitefish, and grass-fed beef, and I think also grain-fed beef. And he did notice that in the grass-fed beef, the kangaroo, another pastured animal, and the whitefish, they all went up. Of course, if you compare grass-fed beef to salmon, it's a significantly less in there. I mean, if you combine the ALA, EPA, DHA, and DPA, which are the four major omega-3 fatty acids, in grass-fed beef, if you consume maybe 100 grams, you might get anywhere from like 50 to 100 milligrams. If you consume salmon, it can be as much as 1.5 grams or something. If you look at sockeye salmon, really high quality salmon. But if you look at whitefish, it actually is a little bit closer to grass-fed beef. And so the short end of it is that yes, it can represent a meaningful source. Is salmon higher? Yes. But if you look at what people more typically consume, is we consume probably more, especially in Western population, more meat, milk, eggs. So by just for sheer virtue of consuming that more often, it contributes more.
Without question, like I don't have the stats. I don't know what the data is, but I would imagine we probably consume an order of magnitude more animal and poultry products than we do fish.
Yeah, that's probably a safe assessment, especially in our Western population. And that's not to say that we shouldn't consume more fish. I'd say, I mean, it depends on what kind of fish, but if you have, very efficient animals, mollusks, for instance, if we consume more things such as perhaps oysters or mussels and things like that, right? These are incredibly nutrient dense foods. Talking about nutrient density, those typically have orders of magnitudes in terms of B vitamins and zinc and iron as well. But my point being here is that, there's definitely been studies done, especially in Irish and Australian populations, that would suggest that they can contribute meaningfully, and you can see a movement, a shift in the omega-3 profiles. And like I said, I mean, it's not nothing either. If you consume 100 grams of beef a day and you end up with 80 milligrams of omega-3s, that's not nothing.
Yeah, certainly. And well, it's obvious if you're producing a shift in the blood profile, then it would be reasonable to expect that that's eventually going to lead to health outcomes.
And one important thing also, John, is the following, and I think people underestimate that docosapentaenoic acid is actually readily converted to eicosapentaenoic acid, EPA, and its conversion to DHA is not as high. But people oftentimes, when they talk about omega-3 fatty acids, only consider EPA and DHA, eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid. But there's also DPA, docosapentaenoic acid, which is readily converted to EPA, and that's usually not taken into consideration, but it's actually one of the richest omega-3s, together with alpha-linolenic acid in beef. So, and that is readily converted in our body to EPA. So that's also probably explains why people usually take into account, say, oh, it's only a few milligrams of DHA, maybe like 10, 15 milligrams of EPA. Yeah, but there's another maybe 20 milligrams of DPA in there that can get converted within our body.
Why is that usually not taken into consideration?
Because I think people heavily focus on EPA and DHA, I'm not sure why that is. But if you look at your fish oil pills, it only mentions EPA and DHA, but it doesn't mention DPA. So I'm not 100% sure why that is.
All right, coming back to one of the questions that I asked you earlier that we then moved on past is, do you have any insights at this point into what contributes to the density of these phytonutrients in meat and milk?
It's plant diversity and not overgrazing, I'd say. Those are having productive plants and having a variety of productive plants. That seems to contribute most to it. So it's almost like the animal can select from what we consider the buffet or salad bar on pasture, can select from a wider variety of plants. And then also the importance is that those plants are grazed, but not overgrazed. So what we typically see is that animals that are rotationally grazed, maybe 30, 50% of the plant remains, stimulating new growth, and they're moved around the landscape or the farm. And then also the diversity piece. If there's 20 plants, 30, 40 plants on the pasture, as opposed to one or two dominant species, more of a monoculture, then you also see that. And I often like to draw the parallels with human nutrition. It's we know that dietary diversity for humans is key too. right? And if we went to a buffet and there was only two foods available, or there were 20 foods available, we would probably be better able to nourish ourselves. And a cow, if you look at it sort of on a molecular basis, is just another mammal like us.
Yeah. I find it interesting that you didn't mention that there's obviously the plant diversity piece, which is not a surprise at all. But what is the contribution of the relative degree of plant health within that plant population? And I'm, of course, approaching this from the perspective of working with lots of produce and fruit and vegetable crops and nut crops, where I believe that, well, I don't just believe, we have some evidence that we can really significantly influence the phytonutrient content of plants based on plants' microbiome integrity and nutritional integrity. So, how does that piece contribute to the overarching view?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. We have to drill deeper into that to find that out, as we are learning more and understanding these linkages between yeah, even soil health and plant health and animal health and nutrient density. Yeah, it is a good point. I mean, if you are able to produce more nutrient dense plants on your pasture by virtue of your grazing practices or other practices that you have, even if it's like planting cover crops or things like that, then yes, I see that could have a synergistic and beneficial effect. But we don't have evidence for that at the moment.
More homework required. This is one particular domain of research where that phrase is just a constant refrain, isn't it?
Yeah, I could probably work on this for the next 40 years, and definitely still don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
So.
Different plants produce very different types of metabolic compounds. And I recall in the interview that I had with Chris Nichols, this is now a couple of years ago, she was describing how they were identifying, if I recall the conversation correctly, they were identifying the specific compound that was produced by soil biology and channeled through mycorrhizal fungi into plants, and then from plants into meat, and they were actually measuring this compound in beef. And I don't remember what the compound was exactly.
It's ergothioneine.
Oh, you're familiar with that. So
yeah, it's ergothioneine.
How many other stories are there like that?
We have a similar story. Yeah, I mean, we're finding the same thing. Yeah, ergothioneine is only expressed in a few soil fungi and cyanobacteria within the rhizosphere. So it has to come from the soil. And it makes its way up through the food web. And it has been found, at least in animal models, and these are talking about rodents or laboratory models, so if we throw it in a petri dish, that it has antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. There has been more interest now also in human clinical trials to study whether it has an effect. But yeah, what you see is that more biologically active soils, you can measure this, for instance, through total exchange capacity, soil organic matter. You see that there's more ergothioneine in the plants as opposed to total mixed ration. That's the comparisons that we have done. So more ergothioneine in pasture versus the total mixed ration, and then also more ergothioneine in grass-fed beef than grain-fed beef. And we're now exploring, are there correlations between soil health, because we're building a big enough data set with hundreds of farms. Can we see a correlation between soil health, markers of soil health, and the amount of ergothioneine in the meat? And is that positively correlated? And those are things we're now exploring indeed. So ergothioneine and then hircinine, which is a metabolite of ergothioneine, are two main compounds that we've been studying and indeed are very well picking up in meat. And then the next part would be, can we pick that up in the human as well? There have been studies with mushrooms. Mushrooms are very rich in ergothioneine because there are fungi, right?
Yep.
And there's been studies done with that. And yeah, if you eat people that eat more mushrooms, have higher amounts of ergothioneine in their blood.
Interesting. So it's fascinating. Do you have any early insights into any possible correlations between soil health and transferring through into meat and ergothioneine levels, or is that you don't have that data yet?
No, we don't have that data. Not big enough, at least. No, not that we can actually, we've seen that correlation or that relationship, I should say, in our initial studies. What we've basically seen, John, is that when we were doing very in-depth profiling on several farms, and these were 5 farms, what we did was we took soil samples of the pasture. We actually took the plants from the pasture. Then we asked the farmer, show us the most conventionally managed cornfield that is closest to you, and usually it was the neighbor or another neighbor a mile apart, and we collected soil there. And then also when we were there at the end of sort of the growing season, we collected some corn and tested that. That was a model of what goes into a feedlot if you manage to grow feed crops, right? Because I mean, about 20-30% of that corn is likely to go into the feedlot. Also in other uses, of course, biofuel. But and what we found there is that the soil organic matter was reduced, the exchange capacity was reduced in those cornfields that were in the same ecoregion. Mind you, it was only a mile apart, so this is definitely a management effect. Pasture was higher soil organic matter, higher mineral content, and then also we saw more ergothioneine in the pasture samples as opposed to the corn samples, and then more ergothioneine in the meat. So we did see this relationship, but only if you have, and there we saw a moderately positive correlation. But mind you, this was 5 farms. So I feel a lot more comfortable by making this statement if we had seen this replicated in a larger number of farms to see if there's actually that relationship holds up in a broader data set.
When I think about the contribution of soil fungi and being able to track that throughout the food web, the next question that comes to mind is whether we might also be able to track the contribution of specific plants. And the one example that comes to mind is a group of organic poultry producers that I worked with a number of years ago who were persuaded that within their own families and their own personal health, they were observing positive health responses based on feeding poultry garlic powder. And so they were getting garlic powder, they were getting much better feed conversion, they were getting overall improved health in the poultry that they were convinced anecdotally was also having a positive health impact on humans. And so you mentioned, when I asked about what are the factors that contribute to this phytonutrient density, your answer was plant diversity and not overgrazing. And I guess within that, are there specific groups of plants or specific types of plants or perhaps even species that you've been able to identify as having observable impacts?
Yeah, we've definitely noticed some things. Seeing relationships in our data is that, especially some of the plants you mentioned. It's interesting that you mentioned poultry because there's a large body of literature that looks at feeding poultry. Indeed, things like onion powder, garlic powder, rosemary, sage, and what you typically see is that bird health improves. It acts kind of as a natural antimicrobial or antibiotic, and then also it enriches the total antioxidant composition of meat. But what we are also seeing, indeed, is that when animals are grazing things like wild onions or something, yeah, there you see onion-derived compounds such as chlorogenic acid or quercetin, gallic acid, which would also be actually in garlic. Yeah, you see that being enriched in the meat and maybe 10 times higher than the next sample that did not have those plants on its pasture. So it is actually those little nibbles on those colorful flowering plants that sometimes people even consider as weeds because it's not grass, that is actually having a beneficial effect. It's almost like the equivalent in humans would be to put some spices on our food, right? And that's kind of the same thing with the animal. And we think like, oh, having a bulb of garlic in our pot roast, how much difference can the garlic make? Well, it does actually provide beneficial effects. So it's the same with the animal with the nibbles on these, wild onion plants, or maybe a little bit of like the flowering clover and other things. That is chock full in these secondary metabolites. So oftentimes when we see a pasture and then you see some colorful plants on there as well, in addition to more of like your grasses, and this is especially in rangelands, right? There's probably 150 plants on the rangelands, especially in mountain pastures, and sort of herding these animals through it. Yeah, they're probably being exposed to 150, 200 different plants. And that's where you see this diversity. So that's why I'm coming back to the diversity piece. But yeah, you're right. Different plant species provide different compounds because we also see with more legumes, we see more isoflavonoids being accumulated in the meat. So there's also this ecoregion effect where you can see, oh, this person is grazing, some legumes. And then, yeah, you see compounds, isoflavonoids are rich in legumes, and you see those then appear, things like formononatin or other isoflavonoids. You see those accumulating in those samples, but then not in other samples because they weren't really grazing any leguminous species. So, yeah, there is definitely that effect. Again, analogous to what you see in a human.
What this brings to mind for me is what if we, and this is perhaps less relevant for rangeland, although it's certainly management associated, but where grazing land is actually being planted, where seeds are being planted, and there's this active engagement with trying to improve and regenerate the landscapes. Perhaps we need to rethink our species selections, not just in terms of providing forages, but also, what if we started thinking about each of these plants in the context of herbal medicine? If you look at the herbal medicinal history and the knowledge that has been accumulated, practically all plant species are known to have some very specific medicinal value and benefits, particularly when in concentrated form. And my thoughts naturally kind of just jump to some of these plant species that are known to be anthelmintics, anti-parasitic plants that can be grazed on for sheep. Well, there's quite a nice body of research on the use of sainfoin and chicory and trefoil as an anthelmintic, that when you graze livestock on these plants, they have this anti-parasite effect. And so it would be really interesting to understand when livestock are nibbling on these plants as culinary spices, as you described it, that obviously is benefiting their own health, and do those benefits transfer? Well, there's two questions. One is, do those compounds accumulate in the meat? And then, of course, it's speculation to think about whether those benefits might transfer to people. That homework still needs to be done.
Yeah, they definitely transfer into the meat. You can clearly see that, and it is interesting, John. If you pick up any book before the '70s on traditional medicine or traditional plants in Western rangelands, for instance, it's usually older books because it was prior to the advent of when we started to use more synthetic compounds, right? Which actually many of them are derived from sort of natural origin. But yes, this is well known, especially on in traditional populations or even earlier sheep herders, right? It's like selecting certain plants or herding the animals through the landscape to pick up certain plants because they have no medicinal effects on the animal. Indeed, now we are quick to give them a round of antibiotic treatment, but back in the day when that maybe wasn't available or cost prohibitive, yeah, you would find other ways as a producer to make sure your animals don't get parasites, right? And that was through grazing these medicinal plants. And yeah, there's a whole body of knowledge on it, and especially in some of these older books. Yeah, it's fascinating to read indeed. That and I often think we've kind of lost that knowledge a little bit as we moved away from wisdom and more into like show me the evidence, right? And so there's a danger of thinking that if we can't prove it in a study, that it doesn't exist. And I sometimes think that's sort of now 2023. That is sometimes the state that we're in, right? This is something I often struggle with as well when I visit farmers. Is we're on the pastures or these rangelands, and you can just see it's teeming with life, biodiversity, right? And you cannot help but think to yourself, like, hey, I don't think we're destroying the earth here. But if I go back to my office and read a whole slew of scientific papers, I can convince myself that that pasture raised, that grass fed beef operation that I've just been to, that is teeming with wildlife, birds, insects, is the absolute worst thing for the environment because of its methane emissions, right? Yeah, that's sometimes what we're up against, and in sort of when we take these complex issues, simplify them according to a few different metrics, and then make policy based on that. And yeah, I mean, I often, ecology is not my primary expertise, but I often talk about this with other scientists and thinking like, and even farmers that are observing this day in and day out. You would call that wisdom, but it's super hard to prove that scientifically.
One of the reasons it's so difficult to prove scientifically is that science really struggles once you include multiple factors and complexity. It's that the scientific method has almost become associated by definition with single factor analysis.
Yeah, the reductionism in science. I mean, we have to rely a little bit on reductionism, right? And to kind of simplify things to understand things. But yeah, there's this inherent risk in that we simplify this complex issue, reduce it to a single factor, and then it's no longer representative of that complex system. And I think that is indeed something that is oftentimes happening. And there's a lot of research being done now to try to understand that. But yeah, it is super hard to indeed to categorize that, and therefore I think there's sometimes this little bit of like headbutting between sort of the ground roots movement, the farmers, and sort of the academic sphere, where farmers are saying, well, I've, 10 years ago when I moved onto this land, I've seen it being regenerated. I've seen bird species return. I've seen wildlife return, insects return. But then, yeah, to categorize that scientifically is very hard. And then if you go to the average meta-analysis, it would say that, well, typically with grazing, biodiversity reduces. But yes, if we overgraze or continuously graze in 9 out of 10 instances, then 90% of your findings are going to be that it had negative effects. I'm interested, what are the other 10% doing?
Right, exactly. Exactly. Stefan, we've had a fascinating conversation about all these various topics related to nutrient density, but people tend to remember stories. What are some of the stories that are remarkable experiences that you've had that really stand out in your memory?
One particularly, and it's almost been a yearly field trip now, is we go up to Idaho in the Salmon Chalice National Forest. And there's a farmer there by the name of Glenn Alzinga. And he
I know
runs
Glenn.
Alder Spring Ranch. Yeah. And it's such a fascinating story because what he does and his crew does, they graze the animals on horseback throughout the grazing season through these vast mountainous landscapes. And I don't know if you've ever seen a cow climb a mountain, but they can be quite athletic if they want to be. So, and we always visit. It's an hour deep into the mountains, and it is so fascinating because what he typically does, he grazes a piece of land every few years, 3 or 4 years, for only a few minutes. So it's very high impact, and then move on. And even when you're talking to him for 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden you turn around, and you're like, where the hell did the cattle go? And they have been moved around again, and so they're continuously moving. And what is particularly interesting about those rangelands, it's so incredibly diverse. Already 200 plants that they get exposed to, and when we then take that into the lab, we have seen compounds in meat that I was like, no idea that this would be in here. And these are some of those, wild onion derived or other flowering plant derived compounds that we have not picked up before, but we picked it up in that meat. And also, it's interesting is that we measure also fatty acids. And this was the only sample that I've seen an omega 6 to 3 ratio that was below 1. So more omega 3s than omega 6s. Typically, like sort of the holy grail is 1 to 1. Not a lot of grass-fed farmers reach it, but I'd say anywhere between 1 to 1 and 2 to 1 is an excellent omega-6 to 3 profile for that one that actually dipped below 1 for a few of those samples. And yeah, that's such a fascinating story, and must have been one of the best pieces of meat that I've ever had. And another fascinating story that just pops to mind was we were testing some chicken samples from actually an Amish farmer, Miller's Bioorganic Farm.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania. Yep.
Yeah, Pennsylvania. And we were just, I bought them just off, from their website. And I had those in the past, and I thought that was delicious chicken, the best chicken I've ever had. And we tested those in the lab, and they also had an omega-6 to 3 profile of 1. And I did not know that was possible in chicken because there's absolutely no reference to that in the literature. Most pastured poultry have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 7 to 1 because they're being fed quite a lot of grains. But these animals have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 1, which is unheard of in poultry. So that was something that really stood by me, is the fact that, it is possible.
It's really interesting. I wonder how they accomplishing that, perhaps by feeding linseed or flax, or are they just not feeding much grain?
Yeah, they are feeding flax, indeed, kelp, even some fish meal. And then they're feeding peas, wheat, barley, so no corn and soy, which is typically high in omega 6s. Also, yeah, that's mainly it. It's kelp, flax, and then some fish meal. And it also doesn't have a fishy flavor, so they must feed that at low amounts. But we know flax is one of the richest sources in omega 3s. And you can see that because especially alpha linoleic acid, which is the precursor to the omega 3 fatty acids that we derive a lot of benefit from. ALA in itself has benefits as well. But with elongation, you get DHA and EPA, but especially the ALA is very rich, and we know that's very rich in flax. So they're clearly accumulating that. And but I was also just surprised that the meat is just so moist. I'm usually not a huge chicken consumer just because I always consider it a little bit bland, and you need to brine it and spice it really well to get like a nice piece of meat. But those thighs were amazing, and I used to buy those when I lived in North Carolina because there was a drop-off location actually in the Raleigh-Durham area. And I just vividly remember those chicken samples, and we had a chicken project, and I was like, well, what if I just slip those in to see what they were like, because that's the best chicken I've ever had. And the nutrient density piece sort of became super apparent there. Again, with the monogastric, they're probably even, it's even more apparent is what we're seeing, because grass-fed beef and grain-fed beef, an omega-6 to 3 ratio of about 2 to 1, 1 to 1 in grass-fed beef. In grain-fed beef, it's about 8 to 1. But then if you look at sort of your conventional CAFO poultry that is eating a standard corn and soy feed indoors, they maybe have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 18 to 1, 20 to 1. So if you then also produce chicken with a 1 to 1 ratio, then the difference is huge, obviously.
When we think about these different omega-3 to 6 ratios, you mentioned a key phrase earlier or one that I think is key with my limited understanding of that, of antioxidants versus markers of oxidative stress. I'm sure I have an overly simplistic view that might be inaccurate, and so I'm going to ask for your insights here. I've generally tended to think of this nutrient density conversation, the impact that it has on human health and potentially on animal health, just very, very broadly as compounds that have an antioxidant effect versus those that have an oxidizing effect, or those that are anti-nutrients that can inhibit digestion or have inhibitory effects of some type. Is that such a simplistic way of looking at it as to be inaccurate, and what is a better way to think about it?
Yeah, it is unfortunately a little bit more gray, John, because we think of things. I hate to break it, but phytic acid, right, gets a bad rap on social media in particular. Phytic acid, because it's rich in beans and being a digestive inhibitor, and it binds minerals particularly. So making, for instance, the zinc in legumes less bioavailable. But phytic acid also has an antioxidant effect to our tissues. So maybe some phytic acid is good. Too much, you might have some digestive issues. Other examples are, but mind you, this is more in supplementary form, but there's a series of classic studies on beta carotene, on carotenoids, and also vitamin C. They're antioxidants, but when taken in high supplemental doses, become pro-oxidants. So it is not that black and white, but the good news is that at least from getting these from food sources, and it is probably because they come in a complex food matrix with a bunch of other compounds like beta carotene, while it being the major carotenoid, it comes probably with 30 other carotenoids in foods. So there are cofactors available that probably prohibit maybe some of these issues. So eating an orange and getting vitamin C from oranges, the orange does not act as a pro-oxidant. Taking a vitamin C supplement, yes, can become a pro-oxidant. Eating carrots and getting beta carotene through carrots or sweet potatoes, no indication that it can act as a pro-oxidant in normal dietary amounts. Take a beta carotene supplement, yes, it can become a pro-oxidant. So there's a gray area that, and even this with livestock raising, we know that some alkaloids can have actually beneficial effects. But if an animal starts to graze too much clover, right, we know they get reproductive issues.
Right.
So, and usually that happens because the animal doesn't have enough other things to select. So if there's a bunch of clover, then if the option is not sexually reproducing or starving, then you're probably gonna pick the not sexually reproducing over starving, right? And I know putting it very crude here, but so that is also the key. But we do see that grazing some clover on the pasture, it can have some beneficial alkaloids that can incorporate into the meat. So it's definitely a dose response thing.
Yeah, it reminds me also of the coumarin. I think is originally derived from sweet clover and was originally called sweet clover disease, I think, or something like that, or was had the effect of causing blood thinning to the point of death for livestock that were grazed on exclusively sweet clover.
Yeah, yeah, correct.
Fascinating history around how coumarin was discovered. Yeah. And then, Stefan, there's this classical argument that gets refreshed by journalists who don't have anything better to do every 4 or 5 years about organic is not more nutrient dense. And I'd like to do a figurative facepalm and say, well, the definition of organics has nothing to do with nutrient density. It's the absence of toxicity, not the inclusion of nutrient density. And just experientially looking at the farms that we have the privilege of working with and observing many different farms in the landscape, there is a certain percentage of organic farms, let's just say broadly 20%, who are holding true to the foundational values of the original organic pioneers. They are seeking to build soil organic matter, and they are using compost, and they're using cover crops, and they're trying to regenerate their soils and build diversity into their ecosystems. And these 20% of organic farms are producing some of the most flavorful, aromatic, most attractive fresh fruits and vegetables that are out there. And then you have the remaining 80% of organic producers, which either are earlier on that pathway or don't have a particular interest in that pathway, that, speaking crudely, appear to be producing absolute junk. And so, in my mind, there's no association between organic certification and nutritional integrity because it is not a part of the organic certification process. And I'd love to get see if you have any insights or thoughts or perspectives on this recurring debate that is a pointless, improper framing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the interesting part about this, if you look at a series of meta-analysis, on average, organic is more nutrient dense than conventional. So I don't know where this comes from. It comes, I think it's the same thing as that myth that grass-fed beef does not impact omega-3s. And someone starts to say that, and then people start to repeat it, and it becomes truth. But if you go into the literature, read a large number of meta-analysis, they typically favor organic a little bit in terms of nutrient density.
It's called being selective about the data you choose.
Yeah, or not looking at the data at all. So I've never quite understood that because there are a number of good meta-analysis over the last few years that have been done over the last 10 years, and done in a large number of produce. And if anything, there's a neutral effect, or it shifts slightly towards the organic. That's typically what you see. But I agree that organic is not always more nutrient dense. So if journalists say that, then yes, that is a true statement. And I think it indeed comes back to the fact that, if you have an organically managed monoculture, you're probably not going to be very nutrient dense, whereas organic probably originally was polycultures, putting synergistic crops, growing them next to each other so that there is soil health that's being built, right? And I was in South Dakota the other day at one of the Turner ranches, and we drove past one of the largest organic crop farms. And it was a lot of it. It didn't look great. I mean, it was, a lot of bare soil, a lot of monoculture cropping. But if you go to other organic farms and there's a bunch of different crops integrated, then obviously that organic farm is probably going to produce more nutrient dense foods than as opposed to your monoculture. 100% agree. And, regenerative will, it's in the early stages. Will that also have incredible variation? Yeah, no doubt there will be a variation. And I think it comes back to a large part also management practices.
Without question. Each one of us as we go through life, we are shaped by, our perspectives are shaped by the experiences that we have and the things that we've learned and the things that we've chosen to ignore. So we all have our own unique points of view. And I'd like to ask you, from your point of view, what is something that you believe to be true about agriculture that is perhaps different from the mainstream view? What is your unique point of view that other people may not be aware of?
Good question, John. I one of the things that immediately popped to mind, but that's because we just talked about it, is that the viewpoint that I read all the time, that there's no nutritional differences between pasture finished animal foods and conventionally finished animal source foods. And that is, I think, different from the mainstream view. And if you just think about it, like I said, we had the comparison earlier. If I put you on a standard American diet for 3 months or 4 months, or put you on a whole foods diet, and I'd ask you, John, do you think my health is going to be differentially impacted? You'd be, yeah, yeah, of course it is. But then it doesn't go for animals, right? And we've kind of disconnected from that so much that we think we can feed or raise animals in very different ways, and that it has little impact on the nutritional composition. And that's something I read all the time online, and even sometimes with fellow colleagues. And yeah, how unlikely is that? If let's say if we go into the lab, take another mammal, we put rodents, lab mice, on diet A or diet B for a couple of weeks, then everyone doing that research would think, oh yeah, of course, going to be major differences based on the diet. If we do a randomized controlled trial, people will be like, oh yeah, of course, going to be a difference. If we do this systematically in livestock, which was what we're doing, then all of a sudden, no, there's no difference. And I think that is such a key point that comes to my mind. It's like, how unlikely that is that? Because we're all mammals. That lab mouse
Yeah.
is a mammal. We are a mammal. The cow is a mammal. If you sort of distill it down to, if I study a piece of meat or a piece of my own muscle or a piece of that muscle from that rodent, metabolically, it is not that different. Here we have mitochondria. We have glycolytic enzymes. We have amino acids. We have the secondary metabolites. We have vitamins in there. It's not that different. So I think the key point is sort of, what we do to our livestock, we do to ourselves, perhaps.
Probably. You didn't say that, but I will.
Perhaps, yes, perhaps. Well, I have a colleague, Pablo Gregorini, he's a scientist from New Zealand, and he always says it like this, and he says, and then we eat that meat, right?
Yeah.
And that's the power. And what does that then do to us? And yeah, this is a question that we have at the moment, but
Yeah.
it is something to look into, because yeah, you do see, I don't want to make the claim here that animals in feedlots have metabolic disease. I mean, we don't know that. We don't even know what constitutes true metabolic disease in an animal. But what I can tell you this is that their metabolic profile starts to shift to one that you would see in humans that is associated with some metabolic derangements. The mitochondria, intermediate enzymes are reduced. We see some dysregulation in glucose metabolism. We see these lipid peroxidation products increase. We see oxidative stress markers being increased, right? I don't know if that truly means that they're diseased, but they definitely have, as compared to an animal that was raised very well, they do look a little bit unhealthier. That is no doubt about it. And it doesn't mean that therefore grain-fed beef is unhealthy to consume. And I honestly, if you ask me, I don't even per se think that is the case, to be honest with you. If I think about this as the broader perspective of a standard American diet, right? If you're eating grain-fed beef with a bunch of fruits and vegetables, then I think you're pretty healthy. To analogous to that, if a fast food chain starts to switch out grain-fed beef with grass-fed beef, that happy meal is not going to all of a sudden turn into a healthy meal, right? So
Right.
when we go into these nuances of single food sources, we do have to take a step back and look at this at the broader perspective of overall diet, which is really what's going to impact our health, and not so much eating an ounce of almonds a day to extend your life with 5 years.
Thank you. That was an awesome monologue. What is a topic that we haven't yet spoken about that is important for us to communicate, or important for you to communicate to farmers?
I'd say don't get caught up in the details as much. Do what works best for you on your farm. There's no magic recipe, because sometimes I get the questions like, oh, what kind of species should we use? And I'm thinking, well, the species that work best in your landscape, right? That is so key. It's sort of this local or contextual part that is so key. What works in North Dakota might not work in North Carolina. So it is really looking at these local solutions. And even then, sometimes this is sort of a bigger thought that I have, is that, I sometimes visit farms in southern Utah, northern Arizona, and maybe raising a black Angus cow in the desert is not the best idea. Because, these are animals that were come out of sort of, and obviously there's interbreeding and maybe you breed in some different genetics, but in practice, these are animals that are out of sort of wetlands, right? Green, luscious pastures. And then you got to create that pasture in the desert by a bunch of irrigation. Oftentimes we see it in these mountain pastures too. There's leafy spurge or other quote unquote weeds. And I'm thinking to myself, well, a goat or a sheep would not consider this weed. They would consider this a yummy meal. And
Right.
these weeds are probably chock full of secondary metabolites, antioxidants. So it is really also looking at that. And I know it's especially here in the western part, this background of the sheep industry is really interesting, right? It was sort of like this idea. If you read about it, the guy escapes me now, but a researcher in University of Montana wrote about this. I think Anderson is his last name, in the 90s, of how the sort of the sheep industry disappeared because it was not considered cool to raise sheep, right? Real men raise cattle, sort of. That's this idea, right? Real cowboys raise cattle, and it's not cool to be a goat boy or something like that. But in fact, in these lands, it probably makes a lot of sense to maybe have multi-species grazing. So this is another part, and now we're getting a little bit out of the box because we have monocultures of cattle, pig, and poultry mainly, but in natural ecosystems, there's always a multitude of herbivores. So, and if you look at studies on multi-species grazing, the vast majority always find co-benefits, synergistic benefits, as opposed to if you graze, and these studies are done, a lot of them in the 90s and the 80s, graze cattle and sheep separately, or you mingle them together, they actually sort of a synergy that occurs. And that's probably because there's differences in grazing practices, and it does seem to benefit the plant as well, because the problem is some plants don't get nibbled on, others do, and you start to get a sort of more of a monoculture. And so the multi-species grazing part is another part, and to even put it further out there, there's often this discussion: can the land sustain exclusively grass-fed beef? And perhaps not, is what some studies would suggest. But I think we should diversify our intake to a larger amount of herbivores: duck, geese, rabbits, super efficient herbivores that can do very well on pasture and don't need a lot of feed. Having those integrated, I know this requires a shift, or eating more goat or eating more sheep, right? Requires a shift. But I think this idea, we think monocultures are a problem in plant agriculture. I think it's a problem as well in animal agriculture. We kind of made our pastures into a giant cattle farm.
That's a fascinating perspective, and one that I can see very clearly, because we know that these different herbivorous species interact with different plant species differently. And one of the obvious variables that occurs, and I've experienced this, is you have some plants that rapidly become unpalatable if they remain ungrazed. If they become too mature, they become unpalatable to beef, for example. But at those unpalatable for beef stages, they are still palatable and used as a food source by sheep or goats. And so when you combine them, then you have these herbivores consuming these quote-unquote unpalatable species. Well, what happens the next time you go through grazing? Let's say it's 3 months later, or 6 months, or a year, or several years later. All of a sudden, those species that were previously unpalatable are now palatable to beef because they have already been grazed upon by the other species, and they're now in a vegetative growth stage. And so you have this interactive synergistic benefit where the diversity of species of herbivores leads to consuming. It changes the behavior of the herbivores as well, and it changes the expression of the plants. Both of those and tend to have a synergistic effect. So yeah, that's a very valuable point. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and of course it's easy for me to say here because I can, when I talk about this to farmers, of course, I mean, we work with several that do have multi-species grazing, but yeah, it does consider a little bit of an overhaul of your business, right? All of a sudden now you have to manage a herd of naughty behaving goat kids that do not listen, right? So it's definitely not that easy, and it requires probably additional perspective. But yeah, if you look at it from sort of the agroecological perspective or the ecology perspective, I don't think there's no good reason not to do it. The reasons not to do it is practical or economical, or you have to have the crew to do it, have enough
It's management.
hands to do it. Yeah, it's the management, and I can certainly appreciate for farmers who are it takes on another risk, who are already sort of working very long hours, not maybe definitely not getting financially rewarded the way they should. That is easier said than done. So I can certainly appreciate that part of it. That it's easy to talk about as opposed to doing it. But yeah, that is aligning incentives also, and I think part of those incentives should be aligned on from sort of a statewide or government perspective. That you are can be rewarded for risk or incentivized to take some of those risks, and as opposed to focusing on maintaining a status quo, right? And sort of the high input monoculture model. So it's definitely easier said than done, and it requires some shifts both on the ground and on the policy level. But yeah, if we are wanting to move towards agroecology, I think that is the way to do it. Is using new modern techniques, the knowledge that we have now, and kind of blend that with traditional wisdom on how we used to do it, because you kind of knew, like you said, John, in wisdom, a lot of people knew that already. It's like, oh, if I have multi-species, I actually see synergies and I'm able to produce more food per acre of land.
Stefan, this has been such a fascinating conversation. Where can people learn more about your work?
My Twitter handle is at Van Vliet PhD. So it's my last name and the letters PhD. And then also, if you Google my name on YouTube, there's many webinars that I've given on the topic, where I actually go through a series of slides. So for people that actually want to see some of the data in figures, that could be a good one. And then also my Google Scholar profile, which is just if you type in Stefan Van Vliet, Google Scholar, you can see the papers. We do make it an emphasis that we make our papers open access. It means I have to sell my kidney every time I do so. But because the open access fees are, yeah, that's another whole other thing in academic publishing, is that you have to pay a few $1,000s for your paper to become open access. Otherwise, it becomes behind a paywall, and then only 100 of my colleagues read it. And so we try to do that as much as possible. And yeah, other than that, that's probably some main things. And people can probably find my contact information, my email online, and always happy to engage and in a friendly and respectful way, even if people don't disagree. So, and which I love to hear too.
Yeah, those are going to be some wonderful resources. And for all of our listeners, we'll link to those in the show notes, which you can find if you go to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast website. All those show notes are linked, and we'll have links to the useful resources. So, Stefan, thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, your experiences. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to having more with you again in the future.
Thanks so much, John. It was a pleasure.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.